young Palestinian immigrant who'd been moving through the hotel for hours, carrying a .22 caliber revolver and nursing grievances against Kennedy's support for Israel that had twisted into murderous obsession. He was just another face in the crowd, invisible among the hundreds of people who'd gathered to celebrate a political victory that was about to become a national tragedy. Part 3: The Sound of America Breaking. The victory speech began at 12:50 a.m., and you could hear Kennedy's voice echoing through the hotel's sound system, his words carrying the kind of passion and hope that had defined his campaign. "My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there," he said, referring to the Democratic National Convention where he planned to challenge Vice President Humphrey for the nomination. The crowd's response was thunderous, filling the ballroom and spilling into the corridors with the sound of people who believed they were witnessing the beginning of something transformative. You were processing a late check-in when the speech ended around 12:57 a.m., followed by the usual chaos of a politician trying to leave a crowded event. Hotel security had planned Kennedy's exit route through the kitchen areas behind the ballroom, avoiding the packed main corridors where supporters and media were gathered. The pantry behind the embassy ballroom provided a direct path to a service elevator that would take the senator to a lower floor where his car was waiting. The plan was routine for the ambassador. VIPs regularly used service corridors and kitchen areas to move through the hotel without dealing with crowds or media attention. You'd seen it dozens of times during your years at the front desk, and the kitchen staff were accustomed to clearing pathways for important guests who needed discreet exits from public events. At 12:58 a.m., you heard something that didn't belong in the usual sounds of a hotel during a political event. Not the cheering or applause or general celebration that had been echoing through the building all evening, but something sharper, more urgent. Popping sounds that could have been balloons or firecrackers, followed immediately by screaming that had a different quality than the excited shouting you'd been hearing all night. The sounds were coming from upstairs, from the direction of the ballroom and kitchen areas, but the hotel's acoustics made it difficult to pinpoint exactly what was happening or where. Your first thought was that someone had been injured in the crowd, or that there'd been some kind of accident in the kitchen areas where staff were managing the complex logistics of feeding hundreds of people while clearing pathways for Kennedy's departure. Then the screaming intensified, and you heard voices shouting words that made your blood freeze. "Get the gun!" and "Kennedy's been shot." The sounds were coming through the hotel's corridors with the kind of urgency that transforms routine hotel operations into crisis management, and you realized that something catastrophic had happened in the areas behind the ballroom. Hotel security officers were running toward the elevators, speaking rapidly into their radios and coordinating with LAPD officers who were stationed throughout the building. The controlled chaos of a political event was transforming into the uncontrolled chaos of an emergency, and you could see the change in everyone's faces as word spread through the hotel that Senator Kennedy had been shot. Your training kicked in automatically. During hotel emergencies, the front desk became the coordination center for managing guests, media, and emergency responders while maintaining as much normal operation as possible. You immediately called the hotel manager and began implementing the crisis protocols that the ambassador had developed for situations that required coordination with law enforcement and emergency medical services. The lobby filled with people rushing toward the elevators, trying to reach the ballroom level where the shooting had occurred. LAPD officers were establishing a perimeter and trying to control access to the crime scene, while hotel security worked to identify witnesses and separate them from bystanders who didn't have direct knowledge of what had happened. The elegant marble lobby that had been hosting a victory celebration minutes earlier was now the staging area for a criminal investigation. Paramedics arrived within minutes, rushing through the lobby with equipment and gurneys, followed by more police officers and FBI agents who were taking control of what was clearly a major crime scene. You watched them disappear into the elevators, heading for the kitchen areas where Kennedy had been shot while trying to leave through what should have been a secure service corridor. The details emerged slowly through radio chatter and conversations between law enforcement officers who were coordinating the response. Kennedy had been shot multiple times in a crowded pantry behind the ballroom, apparently by a young man who'd been waiting in the kitchen areas. Several other people had been wounded, and the shooter had been tackled and disarmed by bystanders who'd witnessed the attack. Your role became managing the lobby, while the upper floors were transformed into a crime scene. Guests who weren't involved in the Kennedy event needed to be protected from the chaos while still receiving basic hotel services. Media representatives were arriving in increasing numbers, demanding access to the crime scene and information about Kennedy's condition. Family members and campaign workers who'd been separated during the evacuation were trying to reconnect and get updates about what had happened. The most difficult part was watching the stretchers come down from the ballroom level. Kennedy was unconscious, his head bandaged, surrounded by paramedics who were working to stabilize him for transport to the hospital. The man who'd been speaking passionately about healing America's divisions just an hour earlier was now fighting for his life, the victim of the same kind of political violence that had claimed his brother 5 years earlier. Other victims followed, campaign workers and hotel staff who'd been wounded when the gunman opened fire in the crowded pantry. The sounds of sirens filled the Los Angeles night as ambulances transported the wounded to area hospitals, while police cars brought additional investigators and federal agents to what had become one of the most significant crime scenes in American political history. As dawn approached, the Ambassador Hotel had been transformed from a site of political celebration into the center of a national tragedy. Kennedy was in surgery at Good Samaritan Hospital, fighting for his life with wounds that would prove fatal within 24 hours. The shooter, identified as Sirhan, was in custody, and the investigation was already expanding to examine how a lone gunman had been able to position himself in the hotel's kitchen areas during a high-security political event. You remained at your post through the night, managing hotel operations, while the building filled with investigators, reporters, and federal agents who were treating every corridor and service area as potential evidence in a case that would be studied and debated for decades. The routine check-ins and guest services that had defined your job were suspended while the ambassador became the scene of an investigation that would examine not just the shooting itself, but the security failures that had allowed it to happen. Part 4: The Longest Dawn. The hours between the shooting and sunrise were unlike anything you'd experienced during your 3 years at the Ambassador. The hotel had been transformed into a crime scene that stretched across multiple floors, with FBI agents, LAPD detectives, and federal investigators treating every room, corridor, and service area as potential evidence in what was already being called one of the most significant political assassinations in American history. Your front desk became an unofficial command center for managing the chaos of an active investigation in a working hotel. Guests who'd been awakened by the sirens and commotion needed information about what had happened and whether they were safe. Media representatives were arriving in waves, demanding access to the crime scene and interviews with witnesses. Hotel staff were being questioned by investigators while trying to maintain basic services for guests who weren't involved in the Kennedy event, but still needed checkout assistance, room service, and transportation arrangements. The most haunting aspect of those early morning hours was the transition from hope to grief that you could see in the faces of Kennedy campaign workers who'd gathered in the lobby, waiting for updates about the senator's condition. Just 2 hours earlier, these same people had been celebrating what they believed was the beginning of Kennedy's path to the presidency. Now they were holding vigil in a hotel lobby, praying for the survival of a man whose campaign had represented their hopes for healing America's divisions. The details of the shooting emerged slowly through conversations between investigators and witness interviews that you could overhear from your position at the front desk. Kennedy had been walking through the hotel's pantry area, shaking hands with kitchen staff and supporters, when Sirhan had stepped forward and opened fire at close range. The senator had been hit 3 times, including a fatal wound to the head, while 5 other people had been wounded in what witnesses described as chaos and terror in a confined space. Hotel security protocols that had seemed adequate for managing crowd control during political events had proven inadequate for preventing a determined assassin from accessing areas where Kennedy was supposed to be protected. The pantry route had been chosen to avoid crowds and media attention, but it had also provided Sirhan with the opportunity to position himself near Kennedy's planned exit path without arousing suspicion from security personnel. Your role during the investigation involved providing investigators with detailed information about hotel operations, security procedures, and the events of the evening leading up to the shooting. You'd been one of the few hotel employees who'd had a comprehensive view of the lobby and elevator traffic during the victory celebration, and your observations about who had accessed which areas became part of the evidence that investigators were using to reconstruct the timeline of the attack. The questions from FBI agents were thorough and repetitive, focusing on details that seemed insignificant but might be crucial to understanding how Sirhan had been able to move through the hotel without being detected as a threat. Had you noticed anyone acting suspiciously during the evening? Did you remember checking in any guests who'd seemed unusual or out of place? Were there any security breaches or protocol violations that might have created the opportunities for unauthorized access to restricted areas? The honest answers were frustrating for everyone involved. The ambassador had been hosting political events for years without serious security incidents, and the procedures that had been followed on June 5th were consistent with standard practices for managing VIP guests during large gatherings. Sirhan hadn't needed to breach security or gain unauthorized access. He'd simply walked through public areas of the hotel like hundreds of other people who'd attended the victory celebration. The media attention was overwhelming and immediate. Television crews were setting up outside the hotel within hours of the shooting, broadcasting live reports about Kennedy's condition and the investigation. Reporters were interviewing anyone connected to the hotel or the Kennedy campaign, seeking details about the security arrangements, the timeline of events, and the background of the shooting suspect. Your name appeared in early news reports as one of the hotel employees who'd witnessed the immediate aftermath of the attack. The most difficult part of the morning was watching the transformation of the ambassador's elegant lobby into something that felt more like a morgue than a luxury hotel. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers that had hosted movie stars and presidents were now serving as the backdrop for one of the most traumatic events in American political history. The hotel's reputation for discretion and luxury would forever be overshadowed by its association with political violence. Kennedy's condition dominated the news throughout the early morning hours. He was in surgery at Good Samaritan Hospital, fighting for his life with brain injuries that neurosurgeons described as extremely serious. Campaign workers and family members were maintaining vigil at the hospital while the investigation continued at the ambassador, creating a dual focus of attention that kept the tragedy at the center of national consciousness. The breakfast shift arrived to find the hotel still occupied by investigators and media representatives, with normal operations suspended indefinitely while the crime scene was processed. The restaurant areas were closed, housekeeping services were limited to essential functions, and guest services were reduced to basic assistance for people who needed to check out or make emergency arrangements. The ambassador had become a place where people came to witness history rather than enjoy luxury accommodations. As the sun rose over Los Angeles on June 6, 1968, you were still at your post after working through one of the longest and most traumatic nights in the hotel's history. The routine concerns of managing room reservations and guest services had been replaced by the complex demands of coordinating with law enforcement while maintaining minimal hotel operations for guests who found themselves in the middle of a national crisis. The Kennedy assassination would define the Ambassador Hotel for the rest of its existence, transforming it from a symbol of Hollywood glamour into a reminder of America's capacity for political violence. And you were no longer just a night desk clerk. You were a witness to history, someone who'd been present when American politics lost one of its most passionate voices, and the country took another step toward the cynicism and division that would characterize the decades that followed. Part 5. Witness to History's Weight. The days following the assassination blurred together in a haze of police interviews, media attention, and the surreal experience of trying to maintain normal hotel operations while the ambassador remained at the center of a national tragedy. Kennedy died on June 6th, 26 hours after the shooting, transforming the investigation from attempted assassination to murder and intensifying the scrutiny of everyone who'd been present during those crucial hours. Your role as a witness placed you at the intersection of law enforcement investigation and media coverage, with FBI agents asking detailed questions about hotel security procedures while reporters pressed for personal observations about the shooting's aftermath. The questions were repetitive but necessary, part of the exhaustive process of documenting every aspect of the evening that had ended with a presidential candidate's death in a hotel kitchen. The weight of witness was heavier than you'd expected. Being present during a historical event felt significant, but the significance was wrapped in trauma that made the experience difficult to process or understand. You'd watched Kennedy enter the hotel full of life and optimism, and you'd watched him leave on a stretcher, mortally wounded by a young man whose grievances had twisted into murderous action. The proximity to both hope and tragedy was emotionally overwhelming. Sleep became difficult during the weeks following the shooting. Every time you closed your eyes, you heard the sounds of that night, the celebration transforming into screaming, the urgent voices of security officers, the sirens of ambulances carrying wounded people to hospitals. The ambassador's familiar corridors and service areas had been transformed into something sinister, spaces where violence had erupted in the middle of what should have been a moment of political triumph. The investigation revealed troubling details about security failures that had allowed Sirhan to position himself in the hotel's kitchen areas without arousing suspicion. The Palestinian immigrant had been carrying a loaded revolver and had apparently been planning the attack for weeks, motivated by Kennedy's support for Israel and his own history of mental instability and radical political beliefs. But the ease with which he'd gained access to the senator's planned exit route raised questions about whether the assassination could have been prevented. Your testimony to investigators focused on the operational details that might explain how Sirhan had moved through the hotel undetected. The ambassador's complex layout included multiple service corridors and staff areas that allowed employees to move through the building without using public spaces. During large events, these areas became crowded with hotel staff, campaign workers, security personnel, and media representatives who needed access to different parts of the building. The kitchen areas behind the embassy ballroom had been particularly busy that evening, with hotel staff preparing food for the reception and campaign workers coordinating logistics for Kennedy's departure. Sirhan had apparently spent hours in these areas, observing the preparations and positioning himself near the pantry where Kennedy would pass while leaving the hotel. His presence hadn't seemed unusual in the context of a crowded political event. The psychological impact of the assassination extended beyond the immediate trauma of witnessing violence. Kennedy's death represented the end of an era of political idealism that had defined the 1960s, and being present for that ending felt like carrying a piece of America's lost innocence. The hotel that had hosted celebrations of American culture and politics had become a symbol of the country's capacity for destroying its own leaders. Media coverage of the assassination frequently mentioned your role as one of the hotel employees who'd witnessed the immediate aftermath, and reporters continued to contact you for months after the shooting, seeking additional details or personal reflections about the evening. The attention was unwanted but unavoidable. Your name had become part of the historical record of one of the most significant political events of the decade. The ambassador's business suffered significantly in the months following the assassination. Guests associated the hotel with tragedy rather than luxury, and many of the political and entertainment industry events that had been the hotel's specialty were moved to other venues. The management implemented enhanced security measures and tried to rebuild the hotel's reputation, but the association with Kennedy's death proved difficult to overcome. Your own relationship with the hotel changed as well. The corridors and public spaces that had once felt familiar and comfortable now carried the weight of traumatic memory. Every shift brought reminders of that night. The elevator that had carried wounded victims to ambulances, the lobby where investigators had coordinated their response, the service areas where Sirhan had waited with his gun while Kennedy delivered his victory speech. The trial of Sirhan became another layer of involvement in the assassination's aftermath. You were called to testify about the hotel's security procedures and your observations of the evening, providing evidence that helped establish the timeline and circumstances of the attack. The courtroom testimony was formal and factual, but it required reliving the traumatic events in precise detail for a jury that would decide the shooter's fate. The broader questions raised by the assassination about political violence, security failures, and the toxic atmosphere that had characterized American politics in the 1960s remained unanswered even after Sirhan's conviction. You'd witnessed the end result of forces that extended far beyond one disturbed individual's grievances, but understanding those forces was beyond the scope of a night desk clerk's experience or responsibility. The weight of witness meant carrying not just the memory of what you'd seen, but the knowledge that your routine work had connected you to one of the defining moments of American history. The Ambassador Hotel had been your workplace, but it had also been the stage for a tragedy that represented something larger about the country's struggle with its own ideals and its capacity for violence against those who tried to embody them. Part 6: The Conspiracy of Silence. 3 months after the assassination, the ambassador had settled into an uneasy routine that attempted to balance normal hotel operations with the ongoing reality of being a crime scene that had shaped American history. The FBI investigation was winding down. Sirhan was awaiting trial, and the media attention had shifted to other stories. But the hotel's reputation remained forever altered, and your role as a key witness had created a burden of knowledge that was becoming increasingly difficult to carry. The pressure came from unexpected directions. Conspiracy theorists had latched onto inconsistencies in witness testimony and ballistics evidence, suggesting that Sirhan hadn't acted alone, or that the assassination was part of a broader plot involving multiple gunmen. Your position at the front desk during the crucial hours had made you a person of interest for researchers and activists who believed the official investigation had missed crucial evidence. The phone calls started in September 1968. Amateur investigators, documentary filmmakers, and conspiracy researchers who wanted to interview you about details that weren't included in official reports. They asked about security procedures, about unusual guests you might have checked in, about conversations you'd overheard, about anything that might suggest a broader conspiracy beyond one disturbed young man with a revolver. Your response was always the same. You'd told the FBI everything you'd observed, you'd testified truthfully during the investigation, and you didn't have any information beyond what was already part of the official record. But the persistence of the calls and the increasingly elaborate theories being proposed made you question whether you'd missed something significant during that chaotic night. The hotel management was concerned about the ongoing attention and the impact on business. The ambassador was trying to rebuild its reputation as a luxury destination, but the conspiracy theories and continued media coverage kept the assassination in the public consciousness. Your role as a witness made you a focal point for attention that the hotel would have preferred to avoid. Dr. Marcus Weiss, a psychiatrist who was researching the psychological impact of political violence, contacted you in October with a different kind of request. He wasn't interested in conspiracy theories or alternative explanations for the shooting. Instead, he wanted to study how witnesses to historical tragedies processed their experiences and integrated traumatic events into their ongoing lives. The sessions with Dr. Weiss were helpful but disturbing. He helped you understand that witnessing political violence created a form of trauma that was different from personal attacks because it involved the destruction of symbols and ideals that extended beyond individual victimization. Kennedy's assassination hadn't just killed a person, it had damaged American faith in the political process and the possibility of peaceful change. But the conversations also revealed how much you'd unconsciously edited your memories of that night, emphasizing certain details while suppressing others that were too painful or confusing to examine directly. Dr. Weiss suggested that your mind was protecting you from the full impact of what you'd witnessed, but that the suppressed memories might be affecting your emotional state and professional performance in ways you hadn't recognized. The revelation was troubling because it suggested that your testimony to investigators might have been incomplete, not because of intentional deception, but because trauma had affected your ability to recall and process certain aspects of the evening. If your memories were unreliable, then your role as a witness was more complicated than simply reporting what you'd observed. The doubt about your own recollections created a crisis of confidence that extended beyond the assassination into every aspect of your work at the hotel. If you couldn't trust your memory of the most significant event you'd ever witnessed, how could you trust your observations of routine hotel operations? The uncertainty was paralyzing, transforming the straightforward work of managing guest services into a constant questioning of your own perceptions and judgments. The conspiracy researchers became more persistent as Sirhan's trial approached in early 1969. They claimed to have evidence of additional gunmen, security failures that were being covered up, and witness testimony that contradicted the official timeline of events. Your refusal to engage with their theories led to accusations that you were part of a conspiracy of silence designed to protect the real perpetrators of the assassination. The accusations were absurd, but they created additional stress during a period when you were already struggling with trauma and self-doubt. The choice to remain silent about details that conspiracy theorists found significant felt like protecting your own mental health, but it also felt like abandoning your responsibility as a witness to one of the most important events in American political history. The breaking point came during a confrontation with Robert Jensen, a freelance journalist who'd been researching security failures at the Ambassador. He'd obtained copies of FBI interview transcripts and claimed that your testimony contained inconsistencies that suggested either memory problems or deliberate deception. He demanded a new interview to clarify the discrepancies, threatening to publish articles that would question your credibility as a witness. The threat was serious because your reputation was the foundation of your professional life at the Ambassador. Hotel guests and management trusted your discretion and reliability, qualities that would be undermined by public accusations of dishonesty or incompetence. But agreeing to Jensen's demands felt like opening yourself to endless scrutiny from conspiracy theorists who would never be satisfied with any explanation you could provide. You chose silence, refusing Jensen's interview request and accepting the risk that he would publish articles questioning your credibility. The decision felt like professional suicide, but it also felt like the only way to protect your sanity and maintain some boundary between your private trauma and public speculation about the assassination. Jensen's article appeared in a Los Angeles alternative newspaper in February 1969, titled "The Silent Witnesses: What Hotel Staff Won't Tell You About the RFK Assassination." The piece questioned the completeness of your FBI testimony and suggested that hotel employees were being pressured to suppress information that might complicate the official narrative of Sirhan acting alone. The article was factually accurate, but misleading in its implications. Your FBI testimony had been complete and honest based on your recollections at the time, but trauma and the passage of months had indeed affected your ability to recall certain details with perfect clarity. The suggestion that you were deliberately hiding information was unfair, but it reflected the broader atmosphere of suspicion that surrounded the assassination investigation. The hotel management called you into a meeting after Jensen's article was published. They were supportive, but concerned about the potential impact on the ambassador's reputation if conspiracy theories continued to focus attention on hotel staff. The suggestion wasn't direct, but the implication was clear. Your continued employment might depend on your ability to avoid further controversy related to the assassination. The choice was stark: accept reassignment to a position with less public visibility, or continue as night desk clerk while managing the ongoing attention from co-conspiracy researchers and media representatives who saw you as a source of information about one of America's most controversial political events. Either path felt like a form of exile from the professional life you'd built at the Ambassador. You chose reassignment to the hotel's accounting department, trading the front desk position that had defined your career for a back office role that offered anonymity but felt like professional defeat. The decision was practical and necessary for your mental health, but it also felt like allowing conspiracy theorists and sensationalist journalists to drive you away from work you'd loved and excelled at for 4 years. The move to accounting was a form of professional witness protection, removing you from public view while allowing you to continue working at the Ambassador in a capacity that didn't attract attention from researchers or reporters. But it also meant abandoning the guest service skills you developed and the relationships with regular visitors that had made the front desk position personally satisfying. The conspiracy of silence wasn't really a conspiracy. It was the natural response of people who'd been traumatized by witness to political violence and who wanted to move on with their lives without being constantly reminded of the worst night in the hotel's history. Your choice to step back from public visibility was shared by other hotel employees who'd been present during the assassination and who'd grown tired of being treated as sources of information about theories they couldn't confirm or deny. The silence felt like abandonment of your duty as a witness, but it also felt like self-preservation in the face of attention that was becoming destructive rather than constructive. The assassination had happened, Sirhan was in custody, and the endless speculation about alternative explanations wasn't bringing Kennedy back or healing the trauma that his death had inflicted on American politics. But silence had its own costs, and moving to the accounting department felt like accepting defeat in a battle you'd never wanted to fight. The front desk had been your window into the Ambassador's role in Los Angeles culture and politics, and retreating to a back office felt like cutting yourself off from the work that had given your professional life meaning and purpose. Part 7. The Ghosts in the Marble. Working in the Ambassador's accounting department felt like exile within your own professional home. The back office was quiet, efficient, and removed from the daily drama of guest services, but it was also cut off from the energy and human interaction that had made the front desk position personally fulfilling. You processed invoices, managed payroll, and reconciled accounts while the hotel continued operating around you, hosting events and welcoming guests who had no idea that one of the witnesses to Kennedy's assassination was calculating their room charges. The assassination had fundamentally changed the Ambassador's character, though the management worked hard to restore its reputation as a luxury destination. The hotel's association with political violence made it less attractive for high-profile events, and many of the entertainment industry gatherings that had been the hotel's specialty moved to other venues. The elegant ballrooms and public spaces that had once hosted movie premieres and campaign celebrations now carried the weight of tragic memory. Your new position provided financial insight into the assassination's ongoing impact on the hotel's business. Occupancy rates had dropped significantly in the months following Kennedy's death, and the revenue from political events and corporate gatherings had declined as organizations chose venues that weren't associated with national tragedy. The Ambassador was surviving, but not thriving, sustained by regular business travelers and tourists who were drawn by the hotel's architectural beauty rather than its political history. The isolation of the accounting office also provided protection from the conspiracy theorists and researchers who continued to contact hotel staff about the assassination. Your name appeared occasionally in books and articles about the Kennedy assassination, usually identified as hotel employee Sarah Martinez, who witnessed the immediate aftermath but declined to be interviewed for this story. The references were factual but frustrating. They preserved your connection to the event while acknowledging that you'd chosen not to participate in ongoing speculation about its details. The psychological impact of witnessing the assassination continued to manifest in unexpected ways. Loud noises made you jump, crowds made you nervous, and political events on television triggered memories of that night in June 1968. Dr. Weiss had warned you that trauma symptoms might persist for years, but the daily reminders of working in a building where you'd witnessed political violence made recovery more difficult than it might have been in a different environment. The most disturbing aspect of your ongoing relationship with the assassination was the way your memories of that night continued to evolve. Details that had seemed clear immediately after the shooting became fuzzy with time, while other aspects that you'd barely noticed at the time became more prominent in your recollections. The uncertainty about your own memories made you question whether your decision to stop cooperating with researchers had been based on self-protection or on genuine inability to provide reliable information. The Kennedy family's ongoing legal battles with Sirhan and various conspiracy theorists occasionally brought the assassination back into news coverage, and your name sometimes appeared in articles about witnesses who'd been present during the shooting. The mentions were usually brief and factual, but they served as reminders that your connection to the event was part of the permanent historical record, regardless of your desire for privacy and anonymity. Sirhan's trial in 1969 resulted in a death sentence that was later commuted to life imprisonment, providing legal closure to the case while leaving many questions unanswered about the shooter's motives and the security failures that had allowed the assassination to occur. Your testimony during the trial had been limited to factual observations about hotel operations and the immediate aftermath of the shooting, but it had been sufficient to help establish the timeline and circumstances that prosecutors used to secure Sirhan's conviction. The ambassador's management made occasional attempts to capitalize on the hotel's historical significance, hosting anniversary events and working with documentary filmmakers who wanted to recreate the assassination for educational or entertainment purposes. These efforts were usually unsuccessful because they reminded potential guests of the hotel's association with tragedy rather than luxury, and because they attracted the kind of conspiracy-focused attention that the hotel was trying to avoid. Your position in accounting provided a unique perspective on these promotional efforts and their impact on the hotel's finances. The anniversary events typically generated media coverage, but not significant revenue, while the documentary projects often required extensive cooperation from hotel staff without providing meaningful compensation. The ambassador was trapped between its desire to move beyond the assassination and the reality that the event had become its most significant historical legacy. The emotional weight of working in a building where you'd witnessed a national tragedy was cumulative rather than dramatic. Most days, the accounting office felt like any other workplace, removed from the public areas where tourists and conspiracy theorists gathered to contemplate the site of Kennedy's assassination. But occasionally, during anniversary periods, when new books or documentaries were released, when political events elsewhere triggered memories of that night, the weight of witness would return with surprising intensity. The decision to remain at the Ambassador rather than finding employment elsewhere was complex and not entirely rational. The hotel had been your professional home for over 6 years, and despite the trauma associated with the assassination, it was still the place where you'd developed your career and built relationships with colleagues who understood the unique challenges of working at a site of historical significance. Leaving would have meant starting over professionally while carrying the same traumatic memories to a new environment. But staying also meant daily reminders of the night that had changed American politics and your own understanding of how quickly celebration could turn to tragedy. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers that had once represented elegance and luxury now served as the backdrop for memories of violence and loss that no amount of professional distance could completely suppress. The ghosts in the marble weren't supernatural. They were the persistent memories of hope and idealism that had died along with Kennedy in the hotel's kitchen areas, the lingering presence of what American politics might have become if the assassination hadn't occurred, the weight of knowing that your workplace had been the site where the country had lost one of its most passionate advocates for peace and social justice. Part 8. The Keeper of Room 516. By 1975, 7 years after the assassination, you had settled into a routine that balanced professional efficiency with emotional management of working in a building that remained forever connected to national tragedy. The accounting department had become your sanctuary within the Ambassador, a place where you could contribute to the hotel's operations without confronting daily reminders of the night that had changed everything about your relationship with the building and your understanding of American politics. The hotel's business had partially recovered from the immediate impact of the assassination, but the Ambassador never regained its position as Los Angeles's premier destination for political and entertainment industry events. The association with Kennedy's death had created a permanent shadow that influenced booking decisions and public perception, transforming the hotel from a symbol of Hollywood glamour into a historical landmark that people visited to contemplate tragedy rather than celebrate success. Your role in the accounting department had evolved to include special responsibility for managing the financial aspects of historical tours, documentary productions, and anniversary commemorations that had become a regular part of the Ambassador's operations. The hotel management had learned to monetize its connection to the assassination while maintaining appropriate dignity and respect for the victims and their families. The balance was delicate and not always successful. The most challenging aspect of this work was managing requests for access to specific areas of the hotel that had been significant during the assassination. The pantry where Kennedy was shot had been renovated and was no longer accessible to the public, but the embassy ballroom where he delivered his victory speech, was still used for events and was frequently requested by filmmakers and researchers who wanted to recreate the circumstances of that night. Room 516 had become your particular responsibility because it was the suite where Kennedy had stayed during previous visits to Los Angeles, and it was frequently requested by journalists, researchers, and conspiracy theorists who believed it might contain evidence or provide insight into the senator's final days. The room was maintained as a standard hotel suite, but managing access required coordination with security, public relations, and sometimes law enforcement when requests came from sources that raised concerns about exploitation or sensationalism. The psychological impact of managing these requests was cumulative and sometimes overwhelming. Each interview with a researcher or documentary filmmaker required you to relive aspects of the assassination and consider details that you'd tried to suppress or forget. The questions were often repetitive, but sometimes revealed new perspectives on events that you'd witnessed but not fully understood at the time. Dr. Weiss continued to provide counseling services, though your sessions had decreased in frequency as you developed coping strategies for managing trauma symptoms and professional stress. His ongoing research into the psychological impact of political violence had benefited from your experiences, and he occasionally asked for permission to include anonymized details about your case in academic presentations and publications. The collaboration with Dr. Weiss had helped you understand that your role as a witness to the Kennedy assassination was part of a larger phenomenon affecting people who'd been present during significant historical events. The burden of witness was both a privilege and a curse, providing unique insight into moments that shaped American history while creating ongoing responsibility for preserving and sharing that knowledge in ways that served the public interest without exploiting personal trauma. Your personal life had stabilized around routines that accommodated the ongoing impact of the assassination while allowing for normal relationships and activities. You'd married a colleague from the hotel's maintenance department who understood the unique challenges of working at a site of historical significance and who provided emotional support during periods when anniversary coverage or new conspiracy theories brought unwanted attention to your role as a witness. The marriage had been a source of stability and healing, providing a foundation for building a life that acknowledged the assassination's ongoing impact while preventing it from defining every aspect of your identity and future. Your husband understood that certain dates, locations, and types of media coverage could trigger memories and emotional responses that required patience and support rather than analysis or solution. The conspiracy theories surrounding the assassination had evolved and multiplied over the years, with new books and documentaries regularly proposing alternative explanations for Kennedy's death. Your name appeared occasionally in these works, usually with references to your testimony during the original investigation and your subsequent refusal to participate in speculative research. The mentions were generally respectful, but served as reminders that your connection to the event was permanent and would likely persist for the rest of your life. The most difficult aspect of your evolving relationship with the assassination was the growing realization that your memories of that night had been shaped by trauma, media coverage, and the passage of time in ways that made them unreliable as historical evidence. What you remembered clearly might not be factually accurate, while details that had seemed insignificant at the time might have been more important than you'd recognized. The uncertainty about your own recollections created ethical dilemmas about your responsibility as a witness. Should you continue to decline interviews and research participation because your memories might be unreliable? Or should you share what you remembered while acknowledging the limitations and potential inaccuracies that came with traumatic witness and the passage of years? The question had no clear answer, but it influenced your approach to managing the ambassador's historical legacy and your own role in preserving the memory of the assassination. You chose to maintain factual accuracy over dramatic impact, providing researchers with documentation and logistical support while avoiding personal testimony that might be influenced by factors beyond your conscious control. Room 516 became a symbol of this approach, preserved as a working hotel suite rather than a shrine, available for legitimate research, but protected from exploitation, maintained with dignity and respect, while acknowledging that its significance extended beyond its function as temporary accommodation. The room represented your own relationship with the assassination, permanently connected to a historical tragedy, but not defined by it, shaped by the experience, but not destroyed by its ongoing impact. Part 9. The Weight of Anniversary Stones. 15 years after the assassination, the Ambassador Hotel had become a pilgrimage site for people seeking to understand one of the most traumatic events in American political history. June 5th marked not just the anniversary of Kennedy's death, but an annual reminder of the country's capacity for destroying its own leaders and the idealism they represented. Your role in managing the hotel's response to anniversary coverage had made you the unofficial curator of a tragedy that continued to resonate with each passing year. The anniversary commemorations followed a predictable pattern: media representatives requesting access to the crime scene, conspiracy researchers proposing new theories about the assassination, and members of the public who wanted to visit the site where American politics had lost one of its most passionate voices. Your job was to facilitate legitimate research and commemoration while protecting the hotel from exploitation and sensationalism that served no constructive purpose. The process required delicate judgment about which requests deserved serious consideration and which represented attempts to capitalize on tragedy for commercial or ideological purposes. Documentary filmmakers needed to be distinguished from conspiracy theorists, academic researchers from sensation seekers, and genuine commemoration from morbid curiosity. The decisions were rarely clear-cut, and mistakes in either direction could damage the hotel's reputation or disrespect the memory of the victims. Your marriage had provided stability during the years when anniversary coverage brought unwanted attention to your role as a witness, but it had also created new responsibilities for protecting your family from the psychological impact of your connection to the assassination. Your husband understood the professional demands of working at a historical site, but managing the emotional toll required ongoing communication and mutual support. that wasn't always easy to maintain. The conspiracy theories had become more elaborate and persistent over the years, with researchers proposing connections between Kennedy's assassination and other political events of the 1960s. Your refusal to participate in speculative investigations had made you a target for theorists who interpreted silence as evidence of cover-up, but engaging with their questions would have required endless involvement in debates that had no resolution and served no constructive purpose. The Kennedy family's ongoing legal and political activities occasionally brought renewed attention to the assassination and the circumstances surrounding it. Ethel Kennedy's advocacy for social justice causes, Ted Kennedy's Senate career, and the political ambitions of the next generation of Kennedys all served as reminders of what might have been if Robert Kennedy had lived to pursue the presidency and implement his vision for addressing America's divisions. Your perspective on the assassination had evolved from traumatic witness to historical curator, but the emotional impact remained significant during anniversary periods and when new developments brought the case back into public consciousness. The weight of witness was cumulative rather than diminishing. Each passing year added new layers of understanding about the assassination's impact on American politics while preserving the original trauma of having been present when it occurred. The hotel's management had developed sophisticated protocols for anniversary coverage, balancing respect for the victims with recognition of the public's legitimate interest in understanding the assassination and its historical significance. The approach emphasized factual accuracy over sensationalism, educational value over entertainment, and dignity over exploitation. Your role in implementing these protocols had made you an expert in managing public interest in traumatic historical events. The most challenging aspect of anniversary management was dealing with requests from Kennedy family members and associates who wanted to visit the hotel for private commemoration or research purposes. These visits required special security arrangements and media management to protect the family's privacy while acknowledging their unique relationship to the site where their husband, father, and brother had died. The personal impact of these family visits was intense and sometimes overwhelming. Meeting Ethel Kennedy and some of Robert Kennedy's children during private commemorations brought the human cost of the assassination into sharp focus, reminding you that your professional management of historical significance was connected to ongoing grief and loss that affected real people whose lives had been permanently altered by the events you'd witnessed. The responsibility for preserving the memory of the assassination while facilitating its study and commemoration had become a defining aspect of your professional identity. You were no longer just an accounting clerk who'd witnessed a historical event. You were a custodian of that history, responsible for ensuring that it was remembered accurately and respectfully while serving the educational and emotional needs of people who continued to be affected by Kennedy's death. The weight of that responsibility was sometimes overwhelming, particularly during anniversary periods when media coverage and public attention focused intense scrutiny on every aspect of the assassination and its aftermath. The questions about what might have been different if Kennedy had lived to pursue the presidency were unanswerable but persistent, creating a sense of profound loss that extended beyond personal grief to encompass the country's lost opportunities for healing and progress. Your own aging and the passage of time had created urgency about preserving your memories and experiences while they remained accessible and reliable. The realization that you were among the last living witnesses to certain aspects of the assassination had made your testimony more valuable to historians and researchers, but it had also increased the pressure to participate in projects that you preferred to avoid for personal and ethical reasons. The balance between historical responsibility and personal protection remained difficult to maintain, particularly as anniversary coverage became more sophisticated and media representations of the assassination became more central to public understanding of the event. Your silence on certain aspects of that night had been preserved through careful boundary setting, but the boundaries were increasingly challenged by researchers who argued that historical accuracy required complete disclosure regardless of personal cost. Part 10, The Final Checkout. You retire from the Ambassador Hotel in 1988, 20 years after the assassination that had transformed your quiet career in hospitality into something more complex and consequential than you'd ever imagined possible. The retirement party is small and private, attended by colleagues who understand that your 2 decades of service had been shaped by extraordinary circumstances that extended far beyond normal hotel operations. The Ambassador itself is struggling by the late 1980s, its reputation forever tied to tragedy rather than luxury, its business model undermined by changing travel patterns and the ongoing association with political violence. The hotel will close permanently in 1989, less than a year after your retirement, its elegant public spaces and guest rooms becoming casualties of an event that had occurred in a kitchen corridor 21 years earlier. Your final weeks at the hotel involved training your replacement in the complex protocols that had evolved around anniversary commemorations, research requests, and media inquiries related to the Kennedy assassination. The procedures manual you've developed runs to over 40 pages, detailing everything from security arrangements for family visits to criteria for evaluating documentary proposals. It's a comprehensive guide to managing public interest in historical tragedy. The retirement gift from hotel management is a leather-bound photo album documenting the Ambassador's history from its opening in 1921 through your years of service. The images show movie stars and presidents, grand galas and political rallies, the glamour and excitement that had made the hotel a symbol of Los Angeles culture. But missing from the album are any photographs from June 5th, 1968, the night that had defined your career, and the hotel's legacy is absent from its official memory. Your personal archives are more complete and more complicated. 20 years of anniversary coverage, research requests, conspiracy theories, and family visits have generated thousands of documents that tell the story of how American society had processed Kennedy's assassination and its implications for the country's political future. The files are organized with the precision you'd learned from hotel management, but they represent a burden of historical responsibility rather than professional achievement. The decision about what to do with these materials reflects the ongoing tension between your role as a witness and your desire for privacy. University researchers have expressed interest in acquiring your files for historical archives, but preserving them would mean making your connection to the assassination permanently available to future researchers. Destroying them would protect your privacy, but would eliminate valuable documentation of how the assassination had been remembered and studied over 2 decades. You choose a middle path, donating some materials to the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library while keeping personal correspondence and private reflections for your family. The donation includes your detailed notes about hotel operations during political events, correspondence with conspiracy researchers, and documentation of anniversary commemorations. The personal materials, your therapy records, private journals, and family correspondence affected by your witness role, remain private. The transition to retirement is more difficult than you'd anticipated because your identity had become intertwined with your role as custodian of the ambassador's connection to the Kennedy assassination. Without the daily responsibility of managing research requests and anniversary events, you're left with the memories and trauma that had been manageable when channeled into professional duties, but are more challenging to bear in isolation. Your husband's support is crucial during the adjustment period, providing emotional stability while you develop new routines that acknowledge the ongoing impact of your witness experience without being dominated by it. The marriage had survived 20 years of living with someone whose professional life was shaped by national tragedy, and retirement offers the opportunity to build a more normal relationship with your own history. The ambassador's closure in 1989 brings a final wave of media attention to the assassination site, with journalists and documentary filmmakers seeking to document the hotel's history before its demolition. Your role as one of the last employees who'd been present during the assassination makes you a sought-after interview subject, but you maintain the boundaries you'd established years earlier, declining to participate in projects that treat the assassination as entertainment rather than education. The hotel's demolition in 2006 eliminates the physical site where you'd witnessed Kennedy's assassination, but it doesn't diminish the ongoing impact of that experience on your understanding of American politics and your own identity. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers that had provided the backdrop for celebration and tragedy are reduced to rubble, but the memories they'd housed continue to shape your perspective on the country's capacity for both idealism and violence. Your final years are spent writing private memoirs that will never be published, documenting your experiences as a witness to one of the most significant political events of the 20th century. The writing process is therapeutic and challenging, requiring you to examine memories that have been shaped by trauma, media coverage, and the passage of decades. The goal isn't historical accuracy. You understand that your recollections are unreliable, but emotional honesty about the impact of witness on one person's life. The memoirs acknowledge the privilege and burden of having been present during a moment that shaped American history, while recognizing the limitations and distortions that affect any individual's recollections of traumatic events. They document not just what you remember about the assassination, but how the experience of being a witness had affected your relationships, career, and understanding of your place in the larger story of American politics. You die peacefully in 2010, 42 years after the assassination, taking with you memories that bridge the gap between the historical record and the human experience of political tragedy. Your obituary mentions your 20-year career at the Ambassador Hotel and your presence during the Kennedy assassination, but it emphasizes your contributions to your family and community rather than your role as a witness to national trauma. The materials you donated to the Kennedy Library become part of the permanent collection documenting the assassination and its aftermath, providing future researchers with insight into how witnesses processed their experiences and how American society had struggled to understand the meaning of Kennedy's death. Your voice becomes part of the historical record, not as a definitive account of what happened that night, but as testimony to the lasting impact of witness on individual lives. The final checkout is both personal and historical. Your departure from a life that had been shaped by accidental proximity to American tragedy, and your contribution to the permanent record of how ordinary people cope with extraordinary circumstances. The Ambassador Hotel is gone, but the memories it housed continue to inform understanding of a night when American politics lost one of its most passionate voices and the country took another step toward the cynicism and division that would characterize the decades that followed. And so we leave you there, checking out one final time from a life that had been forever changed by 8 minutes of chaos in a hotel kitchen. 8 minutes that transformed a routine night shift into a front row seat to American tragedy. Your story ends not with answers about what might have been, but with the quiet dignity of having carried witness to a moment when hope was murdered in marble corridors and the country lost a piece of its soul. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember that history is made not just by the famous and powerful, but by the ordinary people who happen to be present when extraordinary events unfold. The hotel clerks and kitchen workers, the security guards and telephone operators, all the invisible staff who keep the world running while others make headlines and change the course of nations. The Ambassador Hotel is gone now, demolished and replaced by a school where children learn about the future rather than contemplate the past. But the memories it housed live on in the testimony of those who were there, who saw celebration turn to catastrophe, who witnessed the moment when American politics began its long slide toward the cynicism and violence that would define the decades that followed. In a world that demands simple explanations for complex tragedies, sometimes the most honest response is simply to bear witness, to carry the weight of what was seen and felt, to preserve the memory of what was lost, and to understand that some questions about what might have been will never find their answers in the wreckage of what actually was. The marble floors where Robert Kennedy fell may be gone, but the dreams he represented continue to echo in the darkness, calling out to those who believe that politics can be about healing rather than division, that leadership can inspire rather than exploit, that democracy can elevate the human spirit rather than pander to its worst impulses. Sleep well, knowing that every witness carries a piece of history forward, that every person present during moments of transformation becomes part of the story that shapes what comes next. The night clerk who watched tragedy unfold in a grand hotel lobby becomes the keeper of memory, the guardian of what was lost, the testimony to what America was trying to become on the night when everything changed. Sweet dreams, and remember, in a hotel where movie stars slept and presidents spoke, where glamour met politics and hope encountered violence, the most important story belonged to the person behind the front desk, quietly doing their job while history wrote itself in blood on polished marble floors.